She had been finding wildflowers on her doorstep for 6 mornings straight before it occurred to her that someone in the dusty, sun-scorched town of Millhaven, Texas, might actually be in love with her. The year was 1874, and Millhaven sat like a stubborn old mule along the banks of the Pecos River, refusing to move despite drought, cattle fever, and the kind of heat that made men question their faith in a merciful God. The town had a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a cracked bell, a saloon called the Red Spur, and about 200 souls who knew each other's business better than they knew their own hearts. It was not the kind of place where romance arrived quietly. Everything in Millhaven arrived loud, dusty, and with the smell of horses. Eleanor Marsh had come to Millhaven 2 years prior, in the spring of 1872, following her father who had taken a position as the town's only physician. Dr. George Marsh was a soft-spoken man with spectacles that perpetually slid to the end of his nose and hands that never trembled, not even when setting broken bones or stitching wounds that would have made lesser men faint. Eleanor was 22 years old at the time of the flowers. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a bonnet when she worked the counter at her father's small apothecary and medical supply room attached to his office. She had hazel eyes that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, and a way of looking at a person that made them feel she was reading something written on the inside of their chest. Her father had told her more than once that she had her mother's eyes. Her mother, Margaret Marsh, had died of typhoid when Eleanor was 14. The grief had shaped Eleanor quietly, the way water shapes stone, slow and inevitable, and leaving something entirely new in its wake. She had learned to find beauty in small things, a well-organized medicine cabinet, the exact moment a patient's fever broke and their eyes cleared, a good book read by lamplight, and now, apparently, wildflowers. The first bunch had appeared on a Monday morning. Eleanor had opened the front door of the small house she and her father shared on Calloway Street, intending to shake out the mat before the heat climbed, and had nearly stepped on them. A loose bundle of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets, still carrying the cool of the early morning, tied together with a length of brown twine. No note. No card. Nothing but the flowers themselves, which were so vivid against the bleached wood of the doorstep that Eleanor had simply stood there for a full minute, holding her breath. She had assumed they were a mistake. Someone had left them at the wrong house. She brought them inside anyway and put them in a mason jar with water, and they sat on the kitchen table all that day, brightening the room in a way that felt almost like a reprimand, as if the flowers themselves were pointing out how dull the house had become. On Tuesday, there were more. This time, a small clutch of yellow coneflowers and something with tiny white petals that Eleanor didn't immediately recognize. Again, no note. Again, tied with twine. By Wednesday, she had stopped assuming it was a mistake. By Thursday, she was waking up before the sun, lying in bed listening to the absolute silence of Millhaven in the hour before dawn, trying to hear footsteps on the porch. She never heard anything. Whoever was leaving the flowers moved like smoke. Her father noticed the jars multiplying on the kitchen windowsill on Thursday evening. He looked at them over his supper plate and then looked at Eleanor with the particular expression he used when he was diagnosing something he hadn't quite identified yet. "Those are wildflowers," he said. "Yes, father, they keep appearing. Every morning this week." He was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "And you have no idea from whom, not the faintest." He seemed to consider this with a physician's careful neutrality. "Are you frightened?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "I'm curious." Her father nodded slowly as if this answer was medically significant. "Well," he said, "wildflowers are not the currency of a dangerous man." The town naturally had opinions. Mrs. Hetty Caldwell, who ran the millinery shop diagonally across from the apothecary and had eyes like a hawk that had been trained specifically to observe human failing, noticed the jars in Eleanor's window by Wednesday. By Thursday, she had a working theory. By Friday, she had shared that theory with enough people that it had become, in the peculiar alchemy of small-town life, accepted fact. "It's the Beaumont boy," Hetty declared to anyone who would listen, which was everyone, because Hetty Caldwell in full conversational flight was a force of nature. "James Beaumont has been sweet on Eleanor Marsh since she helped him with that infected hand last October. Mark my words." James Beaumont was 26, owned a small cattle operation east of town, and had the kind of loud, easy confidence that fills rooms. Eleanor had helped treat the infected hand, it was true. But he had talked through the entire procedure about his cattle, his land, his plans for expansion, and his views on the railroad situation in a way that had suggested he found his own company more interesting than anyone else's. Eleanor doubted very much that James Beaumont had the patience for anonymous gestures, but she let Hetty talk. The whole town let Hetty talk. It was easier. On Saturday morning, the flowers were prairie verbena, a soft cascade of purple clusters that smelled faintly sweet even in the early heat. Eleanor was crouched on her doorstep looking at them when she became aware of the sound of a horse moving steadily up Calloway Street. She looked up. The rider was already past. All she caught was the shape of a man on a dark bay horse, broad-shouldered, wearing a well-worn canvas coat the color of dried grass and a hat pulled low against the rising sun. He didn't look back. He rode at a quiet, unhurried pace that had nothing performative in it, just a man going somewhere with the settled purpose of someone who always knew exactly where he was going. Eleanor stood up and watched him until he turned off Calloway and disappeared. She had seen him before. She was almost certain of it. The shape of a person becomes familiar even when you can't place a name. She carried the verbena inside and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the empty street for longer than she needed to. It was Saturday evening when she finally placed him. She had gone to pick up a supply order at the general store, owned by Frank Aldridge, who was round and red-faced and kept his store with a meticulous order that was frankly impressive given the chaos of the frontier. She was working through her list when the door opened behind her, and the bell above it rang, and she turned out of habit. He was taller than she had calculated from seeing him on horseback, which meant he was quite tall indeed. He had the kind of quiet that is not shyness but its own form of self-possession, the quiet of a man who has spent a great deal of time alone and found it agreeable. His hat was in his hand now. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, curling at the back of his neck with the casual indifference of a man who had other things to think about than barber shops. His face was weathered but not old, somewhere in his late 20s, with a strong jaw that carried several days of dark stubble and eyes that were, when they briefly met hers, the precise gray-green of sage after rain. He nodded at her. A simple, courteous nod, the kind men gave in general stores when they'd been raised right. Then he went to the counter and spoke quietly to Frank Aldridge about something Eleanor couldn't quite hear, and Frank disappeared into the back, and the man stood waiting with his hat in both hands and his eyes settled on the middle distance, with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for things far more demanding than a store clerk. "That's Cole Whitaker," said a voice at Eleanor's elbow. She startled. It was Dora Aldridge, Frank's wife, appearing from between shelves with the sudden materialization that small women in general stores always seem to manage. "He's got the Whitaker spread out past the Hendersons about 4 miles north. Quiet type. Good man, though, pays his accounts." "I don't think I've spoken to him," Eleanor said. Dora gave her a look that carried several layers of information Eleanor wasn't sure she was prepared to decode. "He doesn't speak much," she said, "but he notices things." Frank came back with a crate of something, and Cole Whitaker paid him, and Frank said something that made Cole produce a very brief, very real smile that rearranged his face entirely for the 2 seconds it lasted and then was gone. He picked up his goods and turned to leave, and his eyes crossed the room and landed on Eleanor again, and this time they stayed there for just slightly longer than a polite nod would require, And then he was out the door and the bell rang again, and the street swallowed him. Eleanor looked down at her list and realized she'd forgotten what was on it. Sunday arrived with the golden, unhurried certainty of all prairie mornings, the kind that made you feel the world had been newly cleaned and placed precisely where it ought to be. Eleanor was up before the sun, which was not her usual practice but had become increasingly unavoidable this past week. She did not pace. She was not that kind of woman. She simply made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with it in both hands and waited with the particular stillness of a person who has decided that whatever is about to happen is going to happen regardless of their anxiety about it. The sky outside went from deep blue-black to the faint gray of pewter, and then a thin line of gold appeared at the horizon, and Millhaven's roosters began their reliable and entirely uncoordinated announcement of morning. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. She went to the front door and opened it slowly, without any of the decisiveness she used for most things, the way you open a door when you are not quite certain you want to know what is on the other side. He was there, not the flowers. Him. Cole Whitaker was standing on her porch, not quite at the door but on the step below it, one hand resting on the post, the other holding a bunch of white prickly poppies and goldenrod so newly picked that the morning dew still clung to the petals. He was looking directly at her, not with the startled expression of a man caught doing something secret, but with the careful, steady look of a man who has decided he is done with secrecy. They looked at each other for what felt to Eleanor like the amount of time it takes a river to carve a canyon. "It was you," she said. Her voice came out quite steady, which surprised her. "Yes," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular resonance of men who only speak when they mean it. Eleanor looked at the flowers in his hand. The white poppies were exquisite, ruffled at their edges like little silk skirts with golden centers that matched the goldenrod exactly. She had never received flowers from anyone in her life. She had not known before this week that flowers could make a person feel so thoroughly seen. "Every morning," she said. "Yes. You never left a note." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what to write," he said. She didn't laugh, though something warm moved through her chest. "How long have you been wanting to?" He considered this with the same gravity he seemed to give everything. "Since February," he said. "When I brought my horse in. Your father set the leg." Eleanor remembered. A horse with a badly fractured cannon bone that everyone had assumed would need to be put down. Her father had spent 3 hours on the surgery while Eleanor kept the horse calm, speaking to it in a quiet, constant voice that she'd always found worked better than restraint. The horse's owner had sat outside on the porch the whole time and hadn't come in once to ask how it was going, which she had found either admirable or strange and hadn't decided which. "Your horse," she said. "You never came inside." "No. You sat outside on the step." "Yes. For 3 hours." He looked slightly uncomfortable, not with the memory, but with having it described back to him so accurately. "The horse made it," he said, which was not quite a defense but served as one. "She did," Eleanor agreed. "We called her Persimmon because she was stubborn." Something shifted in his expression at that, something that was the distant cousin of a smile. "Her name is Duchess," he said. She didn't answer to it that day. She never does. Eleanor realized she was standing in her doorway in her house dress with her hair not yet pinned and her feet bare on the wooden floor, and that none of this seemed to matter particularly. She reached out and took the flowers from his hand. His fingers were rough and warm even in the morning cool, and the brief brush of them against hers was no more than an instant, but it felt significant in the way that a single word in the right sentence is significant. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. He turned his hat in his hands. "I've got chores," he said, and then, "Yes." She stepped back and held the door open, and he came inside, ducking slightly under the door frame, though it wasn't strictly necessary. And she thought that the habit of ducking was probably a courtesy he'd learned for lower door-framed places and had simply kept. He sat at her kitchen table in the chair across from where her coffee cup sat, and he looked like a man who was somewhere slightly outside his comfort but was too committed to retreat. Eleanor put the kettle on and found another cup and was aware, with a kind of interior clarity that she'd only ever experienced when a diagnosis suddenly became obvious, that she had been waiting for this particular Sunday morning her whole life without knowing it. They talked. Not easily at first, not with the practiced flow of people who have learned to fill silences, but honestly, with the kind of pauses that mean thought rather than awkwardness. He drank his coffee straight and black. He told her, in the economical way of someone unused to telling things, that he had come to Millhaven 3 years ago from up near Abilene, that his father had left him the land and the stock, and not much else when he'd passed, that he ran cattle and kept a small crop of corn and wheat, that he had one hand who worked with him, a young Mexican man named Tomas who was 19 and learning fast. Eleanor told him about Boston, where she and her father had lived before the frontier, about the way it had felt like the whole world to her growing up and then suddenly insufficient. She told him about her mother. She told him about the apothecary and the work she did there, and how she had, in the past 2 years, delivered 2 babies, assisted in setting 4 broken limbs, and once talked a man out of a decision he would have regretted by simply listening to him for an hour without offering a single piece of advice. Cole listened to all of it with the complete attention of a man who gives his attention fully or not at all. He didn't speak to fill gaps. He waited until she was genuinely finished, and then he said things that proved he had heard everything, not just the words. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon and Millhaven was properly awake, they had been talking for nearly 2 hours. Eleanor looked at the light and then at him. "You said you had chores," she said. "I do." He stood and the chair scraped back and he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table. He looked at her, and the gray-green of his eyes in the morning light was something she was going to think about later. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I'd like to call on you properly, if you'd permit it." Eleanor considered the wildflowers in the mason jar she transferred them to while the coffee was brewing, white and gold against the window glass. She considered 6 mornings of anonymous beauty left on her doorstep like small offerings. She considered the 3 hours he had sat outside her father's surgery waiting for a horse that everyone else had given up on. "I think," she said, "that you've been calling on me all week, Mr. Whitaker. You just hadn't introduced yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. "Cole," he said, "my name is Cole." "Eleanor," she said, "I know you know that already." The brief, genuine smile that appeared and disappeared on his face was, she decided, one of the most interesting things she had seen in 2 years in Millhaven. She was going to make it appear again. That was now her project. The talk of Hetty Caldwell and the rest of Millhaven shifted direction, like whether when Cole Whitaker was seen tying his horse outside the Marsh house 3 evenings later. It was a Tuesday, and the light was long and amber in the way only late prairie evenings can manage, and he knocked at the door with his hat in his hand and a jar of sourwood honey from his neighbor's bees, because he had apparently consulted someone, probably Dora Aldridge, about what a man brought when he called on a woman properly. Eleanor's father opened the door and stood looking at Cole with the diagnostic expression. Cole looked back steadily. They had met before briefly over the horse. Dr. Marsh had a long memory for patients, 2-legged and 4-legged alike. "Mr. Whitaker," the doctor said. "Dr. Marsh." He held out the honey. "Hope this is acceptable, Doctor." Marsh took the honey, examined it briefly, and stepped back. "Come in," he said, in the tone of a man who has made a medical assessment and found the patient satisfactory. "Eleanor is in the sitting room." The courtship that followed was the quiet kind that Millhaven was not used to. There was no grand gesture in the saloon, no public declaration that gave Hetty Caldwell her dramatic moment. There was simply Cole Whitaker appearing 3 evenings a week on Calloway Street, and Eleanor Marsh being there to open the door, and the 2 of them sitting on the porch when the evenings were warm or inside when they weren't, talking with the increasingly easy thoroughness of people discovering that another person fits alongside them in a way they hadn't expected. He brought things sometimes. Not always flowers, though there were flowers too, arranged now in a proper jar rather than left anonymously on a step. Sometimes he brought something he'd found that he thought she'd find interesting. A hawk feather once. A piece of quartz the size of a fist with a crystal pocket in it that caught lamplight like a small fire. A book that Tomas had ordered from San Antonio and finished, and thought she might like, which turned out to be a collection of poetry that she read from aloud on the porch one warm evening while Cole listened with his elbows on his knees and his coffee going cold beside him. She asked him once in September why he hadn't written a note with the flowers. He was quiet for a moment. The porch was cooling toward night, and somewhere down the street a fiddle had started up from the direction of the red spur, something lively and lonesome at the same time. "I'm better with actions than words," he said. "I always have been. Writing it down felt like it would come out wrong." He paused. "I wanted you to feel it before you tried to figure it out." Eleanor looked at him sideways. The last of the sunset was making the side of his face look like something from a painting. "That," she said, "is one of the most peculiar and also one of the most romantic things anyone has ever said to me." He turned to look at her, and she could see that the word romantic had made him slightly uncomfortable in the way that men of that particular era and temperament always were with words that required them to acknowledge their own tenderness. She didn't let him off the hook. "Did it work?" he asked. "Did you feel it?" "You know it did," she said, "or I wouldn't have given you coffee." The smile. There it was, brief and real and rearranging his whole face. She had catalogued approximately 11 of them by this point, in the way that a naturalist catalogues specimens, each one slightly different and all of them valuable. October came and brought the blue northers that swept down off the Ano Estacado with the sudden violence of a door being slammed, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in an afternoon and sending everyone scrambling for coats and firewood. Eleanor found the seasonal change invigorating. She had grown up in the genuine cold of New England and found the Texas version of winter dramatic without being particularly threatening, which was a minority opinion in Millhaven. Cole appeared on a blustery October Friday with firewood he had cut and split himself, which he stacked at the side of the Marsh house without being asked. Eleanor watched from the window, because watching Cole do physical work was, she had quietly admitted to herself, something she had no intention of examining too closely in its implications, but also no intention of stopping. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of a man for whom every action has a purpose and no energy is wasted, and there was a particular satisfaction in watching a person who was genuinely good at the things they did. Her father joined her at the window, looked out, looked at Eleanor, looked out again. "He stacked the Hendersons wood last February," he said, "after Mr. Henderson passed and before Mrs. Henderson's son came out from Dallas. She didn't know who it was for 3 weeks. Eleanor turned to look at her father. "You knew." "I had a theory," he said mildly. "A physician develops certain observational habits." He went back to his chair and his medical journals, adding without looking up, "He is a very good man, Eleanor." "I know," she said, and she did know. It was not a conclusion she had arrived at. It was a thing she had simply recognized, the way you recognize a truth that was always there waiting for you to be still enough to see it. The question of whether they were properly courting was answered definitively for Millhaven on a Saturday in late October when Cole walked with Eleanor to the church social, which was the nearest thing Millhaven had to a formal public occasion that didn't involve someone being buried. The church social meant pie and potluck and Mrs. Abernathy's slightly aggressive hymn leading, and it meant that the entire population of Millhaven was in one place at one time, which was the small-town equivalent of a newspaper announcement. They arrived together, and the effect was approximately what Eleanor had expected. which was that every head turned and Hetty Caldwell produced an expression that managed simultaneously to convey vindication and disappointment that her original theory had been incorrect. James Beaumont, to his credit, tipped his hat with perfectly good grace. Cole ignored the attention with the easy dignity of a man whose internal weather is not affected by external conditions. Eleanor, for her part, found the public scrutiny mildly amusing and entirely worth it for the fact that when Cole found them a spot at one of the long tables set up outside, and she sat down, he sat beside her rather than across from her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of his arm alongside hers, and he stayed there the entire evening without making any particular show of it, just existing in the space beside her with the quiet contentment of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. She had brought an apple pie. He had 2 slices and told her it was the best pie he'd had since his mother's, which he said with the slight roughness that people use when they are paying a real compliment to something that matters. She told him her mother had taught her. He looked at her for a moment with an understanding that required no further words. Tomas came to the social that evening, a lean young man with a ready smile and dark, watchful eyes that warmed immediately when introduced to Eleanor. He and Cole had an easy working friendship that had the shorthand of people who spend their days in close practical collaboration. Tomas told Eleanor with the unpretentious honesty of youth that Cole had been different the past 2 months. Different how? She asked. Tomas considered. Lighter, he said, like something he was carrying got redistributed. Cole, who was within earshot, said, Tomas. Tomas smiled entirely without apology. November brought news from the north that troubled the town. There had been disputes over grazing rights between some of the larger cattle operations near the Pecos and several Apache bands, whose traditional territories those lands had long been before cattle and fencing, and the blunt machinery of westward expansion had arrived to complicate everything. Eleanor had read enough and listened enough to understand that the history of those lands was not simple, and that the men who spoke of Apache raids with uncomplicated outrage were not telling the whole story. Her father understood this too. He had treated men from both sides of conflicts without discrimination, because disease and injury did not check a man's heritage before they arrived. The trouble was distant enough from Millhaven that it remained talk rather than threat, but it created a tension in the town that showed itself in the way that tensions always do, in shorter tempers, in the way men checked their rifles before they tied them to their saddles, in the slightly faster pace at which everyone moved through their days. Cole came to her one evening in the first week of November with something quieter in his manner than usual. He sat on the porch and drank his coffee, and she waited, knowing by now that whatever he was carrying would surface when he was ready. "I'm going to have to do some night riding," he said eventually, checking the herd. "There have been some losses reported north of us." "The grazing disputes," she said. He looked at her with the slight adjustment people make when they find someone knows more than they expected. "Yes," he said, "though I don't think it's as simple as they are making it. Men are hungry and desperate on all sides of it." "I know," she said. He nodded. "I'll be away some mornings. I don't want you to think I've stopped." She understood immediately. The flowers. She felt something warm move through her chest at the fact that this was what he was concerned about, that she would think his care had ended simply because his mornings were disrupted. "Cole," she said, "I know the flowers are not the point." He looked at her with the gray-green eyes and the particular quiet that was his version of being moved. "What is the point?" he asked. "You are," she said simply. The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that happens between people when something has been said so perfectly that any words added to it would be a reduction. November passed into December, and the rhythm of Cole's visits held steady even through the busy periods of cattle management, and the cold that settled like a gray blanket over the plains. Eleanor found, as December progressed, that the shape of her days had reorganized themselves around his presence in the quiet way that the most important things always reorganize you, not dramatically, but thoroughly. She also found that she had begun to think about things she hadn't let herself think about since she was much younger, since before her mother's death, since before grief had reordered her priorities into something more practical and less tender. She thought about what it might be like to live somewhere that was not her father's house. She thought about space that was hers and someone else's together. She was careful with these thoughts. She didn't rush them or suppress them. She simply let them exist. Her father noticed everything because he always noticed everything. One December evening, he set down his journal and looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that she recognized as the one he used when he was about to say something he had thought carefully about. "Eleanor," he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it in the spirit in which it is given." She set down the mending she was working on. "Go ahead, father." "Came to the frontier for my own reasons," he said, "and I have not regretted it, particularly because you have adapted to it with a grace that your mother would have recognized immediately. But I did not come here expecting you to be content alone indefinitely. Also did not come here expecting you to be content dependent on me indefinitely." He paused and recalibrated. "What I'm trying to say, somewhat badly, is that Cole Whitaker is a good man, and you are a luminous woman, and watching the two of you on this porch of an evening is the best medicine I have encountered in 30 years of practice." Eleanor looked at her father, at his kind face and his slightly crooked spectacles, and the lines around his eyes that had deepened since her mother died, and she felt a love for him that was entirely full and uncomplicated. "Thank you, father," she said. "I am also," he added, with the slight primness of a man who does not want to be mistaken for a sentimentalist, "perfectly capable of managing alone. Have not been entirely helpless simply because I have had company." "I know," she said, smiling. "Good." He picked up his journal. "That is all." The Wednesday before Christmas, Cole arrived at the Marsh house with his hat in his hand and an expression that Eleanor recognized after all these months as his version of significant nerves. It was subtle, a slightly more deliberate quality to his stillness. The way the set of his shoulders was careful rather than natural. She noticed it immediately. He asked her father first. She knew this because her father had an expression when he came back to the sitting room that was the exact opposite of his habitual medical neutrality. He looked like a man who had been given news he had been hoping for and was attempting, unsuccessfully, to appear unsurprised by it. "Mr. Whitaker would like a word with you on the porch," her father said, and went back to his journal with the absorbed focus of a man who is pretending very hard to read. The evening was cold, the sharp, clean cold of a Texas December, and the sky was the blue-black of deep water with stars so numerous and close that they seemed to push down toward the earth. Eleanor wrapped her shawl around herself and Cole stood on the porch step, one hand gripping the post, and he looked at her with the eyes she had been thinking about since February, and he said what he said. He did not say it with speeches or poetic declarations. He said it the way he said everything, which was directly, and with the weight of a man who does not offer what he doesn't mean. "I've been trying to figure out the right words for this since about May," he said, "and I've decided there probably aren't any. So I'm just going to say that I love you, Eleanor, and I want to marry you. And if you'll have me, you'll have Duchess and Tomas and 4 miles of difficult land, and a man who is better at actions than words, but will spend the rest of his life learning to use both." She had known it was coming. She had not known that knowing it was coming would make absolutely no difference to the way it arrived. Her eyes stung, and she pressed her lips together, and she looked at him standing in the cold starlight, and she thought about wildflowers on a doorstep in the blue hour before dawn, and a man who had sat outside a surgery for 3 hours because he could not leave his horse to face it alone, and coffee on a Sunday morning when neither of them had planned it, and 8 months of evenings that had remade her understanding of what it was possible to feel for another person. "Yes," she said. "Cole. Yes." He let out a breath that she realized he had probably been holding since May, and he stepped up onto the porch and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with the gray-green eyes and the expression of a man who has been given something he wasn't entirely sure he deserved and intends to make every effort to prove himself wrong about that. He had a ring. He had had it made by the silversmith in San Marcos, which was a day's ride, and the silversmith had set a small piece of garnet in it because Cole had told him her eyes were the color of something warm, and the silversmith had done his best with limited description. It fit perfectly. Eleanor looked at it on her finger in the lamplight that spilled from the window and found that she had nothing to say, which was unusual for her. "I measured," Cole said. "How?" she asked. "One of your rings," he said, "from your dresser. I borrowed it and brought it back the same day." "When?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "September," he said. She looked at him. "You planned this in September." "Planned it in May," he corrected. "In September I got the ring made." Eleanor laughed. It was a real, full laugh that the cold evening caught and carried, and she saw the smile on his face, the real one that rearranged everything. And she thought that she was going to spend the rest of her life making that happen, and that was exactly the kind of life she wanted. Her father appeared in the doorway without any pretense of not having been listening. He looked at Eleanor's hand and then at Cole, and then he put out his hand and shook Cole's with both of his, which was the highest expression of warmth in the Marsh family's emotional vocabulary, and he said, "Welcome, son," in a voice that was steady but required some effort. They were married in the spring. The church bell rang, the one with the crack in it that gave it a slightly imperfect voice, and Eleanor thought that imperfect voices were sometimes the most honest ones. The whole of Millhaven came, because of course they did, and Hetty Caldwell cried, which she would later vehemently deny, and Tomas wore his best shirt and a hat he had clearly borrowed from someone, and stood beside Cole with the solemn pride of a younger brother at an older brother's wedding. Eleanor wore a dress that she and Dora Aldridge had made together over the winter, cream-colored cotton with small buttons down the bodice that were the devil to manage alone, and which she had practiced managing alone for approximately a month. She carried wildflowers. Of course she did. Prairie verbena and bluebonnets and the little white-petaled things she had never looked up the name of and had by now decided she preferred unnamed. Just flowers that existed on her doorstep, and then in her hands on the morning, everything changed. Cole stood at the altar in a dark coat he'd had fitted in San Marcos, same trip as the ring probably, and he looked at her walking toward him with the complete, unguarded attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And whatever was written in his expression was so unambiguous that even Reverend Hoskins noticed it and made a brief mental note that this was the kind of marriage that would not require much pastoral intervention. The vows were the traditional ones, because Cole was not a man who needed to invent language when the existing language already said the thing truly. But when the Reverend reached the part about the rings and Cole put the garnet ring back on her finger, where it belonged now permanently, he looked at her and said, very quietly just for her, "Every morning, Eleanor. The rest of our lives." And Eleanor said just as quietly, "I'll leave my door unlocked." They settled into the Whitaker spread that spring, 4 miles north of Millhaven in the direction of real prairie, where the land opened up and the sky was enormous and the grass went silver in the wind. The house was solid but spare, built by Cole's father and maintained carefully by Cole, with good windows that faced south and east to catch the morning light, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a kitchen that needed work but had good bones. Eleanor made it into a home with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. She did not transform it dramatically. She added things that were hers alongside things that were his, and the combination became theirs, which was better than either separately. Her books on the shelves beside his almanacs and journals. Her mother's quilts on the beds. his collection of stones and feathers and curious objects on the windowsills beside her mason jars. The kitchen was repainted. A vegetable garden was planted along the east side of the house that Tomas helped dig out over 2 weekends, grumbling happily the whole time. Eleanor kept her work at the apothecary in Millhaven 3 days a week, and rode in with Cole when his route took that direction, or alone when it didn't. The road between the Whitaker spread and Millhaven was good enough for a horse, and she was a competent rider, having learned in her first year in Texas with the grim determination of someone who recognizes a practical necessity. Her father visited every Sunday, and Sunday dinners became the architecture of the week, something everyone organized themselves around. The first summer of their marriage was not without difficulty, because nothing worth having is. The cattle market was volatile, hit by the economic panic that had rippled west from the eastern financial catastrophe of the previous year, and Cole managed it with the same steadiness he brought to all adversity, which was to assess it clearly, adapt without complaint, and not waste energy being angry at things beyond his control. Eleanor found this quality, which she had identified early, to be perhaps the most useful of all of them in the daily work of a shared life. There were arguments. They were rare, and they were always about real things, never about nothing, which Eleanor found she preferred to the kind of chronic low-grade irritation that she had observed in other couples. Cole's reticence, which she had found charming in courtship, occasionally manifested in marriage as a reluctance to tell her when something was troubling him, not out of deception but out of the deeply ingrained habit of a man who had handled everything alone for a long time. She addressed this directly the first time it happened because she was Eleanor and directness was her native language. "Cole," she said, "am not made of something that will break if I know you are worried." He looked at her. "I know that. Then tell me when something is wrong. I'm not asking to solve it. I'm asking to know." A pause. "Then the north pasture grass is failing. I don't know if the herd will make weight by November." "Thank you," she said. "Now we can think about it together." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a very unusual woman," he said. "You knew that in February," she said. "They managed the north pasture. They moved a portion of the herd to the Hendersons' leased land, which the widowed Mrs. Henderson was glad to have grazed for a share of the profit, and Cole and Tomas worked 18-hour days through July and August and came in at night smelling of cattle and dust and sweat. And Eleanor fed them and cleaned wounds, and one night when the work was particularly brutal, she rode out to the north pasture herself with a lantern and a meal, and sat beside Cole on the tailgate of the wagon in the dark, while he ate and talked to her about the herd in the way that very tired men talk about work, which is really talking about all the things underneath the work. By September, the cattle made weight and the crisis passed, and Cole came home one evening and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with the expression that meant something was moving through him that he needed to find words for. "You didn't have to come out to the north pasture," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to. It meant something," he said. "It was supposed to." He was quiet. "Then, Eleanor, I'm not good at telling you the things I feel in the ordinary moments. I know that, but I want you to know that every single day I'm aware of exactly how different this is from what I expected my life to be." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this quiet, difficult, good man who left Wildflowers on doorsteps and sat outside surgeries, and built his communications out of action because words had never quite been equal to what was inside him. "Cole," she said, "you left me flowers every morning for a week, and then knocked on my door on a Sunday and changed my life. Think your communication abilities are doing just fine." He looked at her for a long moment, and then the smile arrived, the real one, the one she loved most in the world, and he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and outside the prairie wind moved through the grass and the stars came out over Texas, and everything was exactly as it should be. In October of that first year, Eleanor discovered she was carrying a child. She told her father first, because some habits of intimacy are the most permanent, and Dr. George Marsh removed his spectacles and cleaned them carefully and then put them back on and looked at his daughter and said, "Your mother would be so very happy," in a voice that was the thinnest it had ever been, and Eleanor held his hand for a long time in the warm office that smelled of camphor and dried herbs. She told Cole that evening. She had considered various ways to do it and settled, as she always did, on directness. "I'm going to have a baby," she said, at the kitchen table after supper. Cole went completely still in the way that people go still when something large is happening inside them, and the body hasn't gotten the instructions yet. He looked at her and she watched something move through his face that was too complex to name, something that was equal parts wonder and terror, and a tenderness so fierce it was almost grief. "When?" he said. "June," she said. "Your father would have been a grandfather in June." Cole's father had died 2 years before Eleanor came to Millhaven. She had known this for months but had never said it quite this way before. Something in his expression shifted and settled. "Yes," he said quietly. "He would have." He stood up from the table and came around to her and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her with the gray-green eyes and said, "You are remarkable," which was not what she expected and was also exactly right. "We both contributed," she said. The brief, startled laugh that escaped him was the rarest version of his smiles, the ones that ambushed him. She added it to her catalog. The winter of their first year was mild enough for that part of Texas, which was to say it was cold and occasionally brutal but not catastrophic. Eleanor's pregnancy settled into her body with an uncomplicated steadiness that her father said was fortunate but not surprising, given his daughter's general approach to everything. She kept working at the apothecary into January, when Frank Aldridge began looking at her sideways with an expression of acute Midwestern anxiety every time she lifted anything, and she reduced her days to 2, and then 1 as February arrived. Cole's awareness of her shifted in a way that was, she thought, one of the most quietly moving things about the whole experience. He didn't treat her as fragile. He was simply more present, in the particular way of someone redistributing their attention without making an announcement of it. He found ways to absorb tasks without making a performance of absorbing them. He appeared when she needed assistance before she asked. He asked her in the evenings how she felt, with the specificity of a man who wants a real answer rather than the social reassurance of a good answer. Tomas, for his part, was comprehensively delighted. He had come from a large family in Lerdo, and the prospect of a baby on the Whitaker spread seemed to him like the natural and correct conclusion to several months of observing what he described as the most painfully slow courtship in the history of the Pecos River region. He began leaving vegetables from the garden at the kitchen door, which Eleanor pointed out was the exact behavioral pattern that had started all of this. "It works," Tomas said, completely without shame. Spring came the way spring always comes to the Texas plains, suddenly and then all at once, the grass going from brown to green in a span of days that felt almost implausible, the wildflowers erupting along every roadside and creek bank and fence line in explosions of color that made the whole landscape feel like something made to prove a point about endurance. Eleanor stood on the south porch in April with her hands at the small of her back in the universal posture of the late pregnant, and looked at the prairie and found it more beautiful than she had ever found anything. Cole appeared beside her. He did this, materialized without noise, another habit of a man who had spent years moving quietly in large, silent spaces. He stood beside her and they looked at the spring prairie together, and he put his arm around her with the easy comfort of long practice, which 8 months of marriage had already established, and she leaned against him and felt the solid warmth of him against her side. "I used to find it lonely," he said. He didn't have to specify what he meant. The prairie. The space, the quiet that was everywhere here. "And now," she said, "now it's just home," he said. Their son was born on a June morning with the sun coming through the east windows of the bedroom in long warm bars, And Dr. George Marsh delivered his first grandchild with hands that did not tremble and eyes that were bright behind his spectacles. Cole sat outside the bedroom door for the duration, in the exact mirror image of a man sitting outside a surgery on a February morning 3 years before, and Eleanor found later that she had known he was there the whole time. They named him James Marsh Whitaker, James for no particular man alive but for the cleanness of the name, and Marsh for Eleanor's family, because the name needed to carry forward into a new place. He arrived with a full head of dark hair and Cole's gray eyes, and Eleanor's expression of having arrived somewhere with strong opinions about the quality of the hospitality. When Cole first held him, sitting in the chair beside the bed with the June light on both of them, Eleanor watched her husband's face do something she had never seen it do before, which was to simply give up all the careful management. He looked at his son with a complete openness that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen, and she felt something in her chest that was so large and warm that it briefly displaced the ability to form sentences. "Hello," Cole said to the baby very quietly as if they were meeting somewhere private. "I'm your father." James regarded him with the ancient, slightly suspicious expression of all newborns, and Cole looked at him for a long time with the gray-green eyes and then looked up at Eleanor. "He looks like you," he said. "He has your eyes," she said. "My eyes in your face," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's how it works." The summer that followed was the fullest summer Eleanor had ever lived. Full in the way of things that crowd into a life and leave no gaps, not because they overwhelm but because they fit. Millhaven absorbed young James Whitaker into its collective awareness with the enthusiasm of a small town that has very little new information most of the time. Dr. Marsh came every Sunday and sat with the baby for long periods in the particular stillness of a grandfather who cannot quite believe his good fortune. Tomas held the baby with excessive care and made faces at him that earned the first real smiles. Cole carried his son in the crook of his arm and took him out on the porch in the evenings to show him the prairie, which was, Eleanor thought, exactly what she would have expected. Hetty Caldwell brought a quilt and took detailed note of the baby's features, and reported to the town with great authority that he was a Whitaker through and through, which was not entirely accurate, but Hetty was not the sort of woman to let accuracy disrupt a good story. The autumn of that year brought a change that Eleanor had been anticipating with mixed feelings since before the baby was born. Her father had been speaking, with increasing frequency and increasing specificity, about a colleague in Austin, a doctor. Prentice, who was establishing a proper hospital, and had extended an invitation to Dr. Marsh to come and be part of it. Austin was a far cry from Millhaven. It was not the frontier in the same way. There would be more resources, better equipment, less of the isolated improvisation that frontier medicine required, and that George Marsh was genuinely gifted at, but which had taken a toll on him that his daughter recognized even when he minimized it. Eleanor thought about it for 2 months without saying much. Cole noticed because Cole always noticed, and one evening in October he sat beside her on the porch in the cooling air and said, "Tell me." "My father is going to go to Austin," she said. "I know," he said. "He told me." She looked at him. "When?" "August," he said. "He wanted to tell me before he told you. He was concerned about leaving you without support." She absorbed this. Her father and Cole, in the year and a half since the wedding, had developed the kind of relationship that surprised people who expected the territorial friction of men who loved the same person. They respected each other with a thoroughness that ran deeper than courtesy. Cole had been, Eleanor knew, something her father had not expected to find in Millhaven, someone who matched her in the particular ways she needed matching. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That she will be fine," Cole said, "that she has everything she needs here. But that you will miss him greatly, and that he should visit so often it becomes a nuisance." Eleanor pressed her lips together to manage the emotion that arrived without permission. He agreed to that. He said that nuisance was in the eye of the beholder, and that he intended to be here for James's first Christmas, his first birthday, his first words, and any subsequent first that seemed to warrant the journey. She laughed, and the sound of it lifted into the October air and joined the sounds of the evening, and Cole put his arm around her, and she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the familiar ease that was the best thing about knowing someone all the way through. Her father left in November, with his medical bags and his journals, and the spectacles that still slid to the end of his nose, and his steadfast refusal to make the departure sentimental, which meant he was very nearly crying by the time he got onto the stage, and Eleanor was definitely crying, which she considered entirely fair and adult. He wrote long, careful letters in the physician's handwriting that was surprisingly legible for the profession, full of observations about Austin and the hospital and the peculiarities of practicing medicine in a place with actual equipment. Eleanor wrote back with equal thoroughness, and James had his own section of each letter, which grew more detailed as he grew more capable of doing things worth reporting. Millhaven was different without her father, and the same. The town kept its rhythms. The Red Spur kept its noise. Hetty Caldwell kept her commentary. The apothecary was taken over by a young man from San Antonio named Dr. Felix Ruiz, who was 26 and energetic, and possessed the kind of enthusiasm for new medical developments that was either going to revolutionize frontier medicine or result in a very interesting series of lawsuits. Eleanor liked him immediately and found herself advising him on the particular requirements of Millhaven patients with the authority of someone who had been doing it for 4 years. The second year of their marriage settled into the shape that all good marriages settle into eventually, which is not the shape of courtship, but something more substantial and more real. The daily fabric of a shared life, which is unglamorous and irreplaceable. Cole had begun talking more, a gradual and probably involuntary development that Eleanor chose not to point out too directly because doing so would likely slow it down. He talked about the cattle and the land and Tomas's progress, and the state of the river and the weather patterns, and increasingly about things that were not directly practical, about the night sky that he had learned from his father, about the war that he had missed by virtue of being 14 in 1865, but whose shadow he had grown up under, about the way the land had looked before the fences went up, and whether that was better or just different. Eleanor listened to all of it with the same attention she had always given, and responded with the direct honesty that was her nature, and they disagreed about things sometimes and agreed about things more often, and every conversation was another line in the map they were making of each other. James learned to walk in February of the following year, hauling himself upright against the kitchen table leg, and standing with the trembling determination of someone attempting something that logic suggests is impossible. Cole was home when it happened and crouched at the other end of the kitchen with his hands out and said, "Come on then," in the voice he used for horses and his son, which was the same voice and equally effective. James looked at him with the gray-green eyes and walked 4 lurching steps and arrived in his father's hands with the triumphant indifference of someone who has just proven something and is already thinking about the next thing. "I'm writing to my father," Eleanor said from the doorway, where she had been watching with her hand over her mouth. "He already wrote it into the last letter," Cole said, standing with James in his arms and looking faintly astonished. "I watched him do it. He was guessing," Eleanor said. "He was anticipating," Cole corrected, and the look he gave her over their son's head was the full version of the look she had first seen on a Sunday morning in June of 1874, when he had stood on her porch with Wildflowers in his hand, and looked at her like a man who has decided to be done with secrecy, and is not afraid of what comes next. The spring of 1877 arrived with all the fanfare of Texas springs, which is to say with violence and color, and a complete lack of apology for the winter that had preceded it. Eleanor was 30 years old and felt it as a milestone, not in the way of diminishment, but in the way of solidness, as if the additional years had simply added density to her rather than anything else. She was tending the east garden when she found herself sitting back on her heels and doing the kind of arithmetic that women do when the body begins presenting certain evidence. She told Cole at supper. He looked up from his plate with the same complete stillness as the first time. Learned nothing, she thought with affection. June again, he said. December this time, she said. He set down his fork. December is cold. Babies do not schedule themselves around weather considerations, she said. Our son walked in February, he said, as if this were evidence of poor planning. He walked into your hands, she said. Consider that excellent timing. The stillness broke into the real smile, the one that had been hers to catalog for 3 years now, and still did exactly the same thing to her chest every time it appeared. Their daughter arrived in December, which was in fact cold but also possessed of a particular stillness that Eleanor found appropriate. She came at night, which her brother had not, and she arrived with Eleanor's auburn hair and her grandfather's perfectly straight nose, and a set of opinions about the world that she expressed at considerable volume from her first moment in it. They named her Margaret Ruth Whitaker, Margaret for Eleanor's mother without discussion, Ruth for Cole's, which he suggested quietly one evening in October, and Eleanor had looked at him and said yes before he finished the sentence. Doctor. George Marsh came from Austin for the birth, and arrived 2 days before and left 3 weeks after, and held his granddaughter with the particular joy of a man who has been given more than he asked for, which is the best kind of joy. He sat in the kitchen in the January mornings and drank Cole's strong black coffee, and talked with him about the state of medicine, and the state of cattle, and the state of the country with the ease of 2 people who have long since cleared the formal registers. You have built something very good here, Dr. Marsh said one morning, looking out the window at the prairie. We built it, Cole said. Dr. Marsh looked at him over his spectacles. Yes, he said. You did, both of you. That is actually what I said. The years that followed the birth of Margaret were years of accumulation in the best sense. The ranch grew modestly and solidly under Cole's careful management. Tomas became a full partner in the operation and brought his younger brother Alejandro out from Lerdo to help, and the Whitaker spread became the kind of place that was known in the county not for its size, but for its reliability, its good cattle, its fair dealing. Cole's reputation as a man of his word and solid judgment spread the way good reputations do, slowly and without exaggeration, which makes them stick. James grew into a boy with his mother's curiosity and his father's silence, a combination that produced a child who observed everything with great attention and reported his conclusions in brief, precise sentences that often startled adults with their accuracy. He followed Cole around the ranch from the time he could keep up, learning things without being formally taught them, absorbing the language of cattle and land, and whether that was his father's first language. Margaret, from the moment she was mobile, was an enterprise. She had Eleanor's directness and something else entirely, a kind of joyful recklessness that was all her own, that manifested in climbing things that were not designed to be climbed and introducing herself to every horse, dog, and uncertain stranger she encountered with the absolute confidence of someone who has never considered the possibility of not being welcomed. Cole watched her with an expression that was equal parts pure love and low-level sustained alarm. She gets it from you, Cole said one evening after retrieving Margaret from the top of the corral fence. She absolutely does not, Eleanor said. The directness, he said. The certainty. The certainty is from you, Eleanor said. You are the most certain man I have ever met. You were certain enough in your feelings about me to leave flowers on my doorstep for a week without signing your name to them. That was not certainty, he said. That was terror. She looked at him. You were terrified. Of course I was terrified, he said, with the slight roughness of a man admitting something he would not have admitted 5 years ago. You were the most formidable woman I had ever encountered, and I had no idea what to say to you, and I was fairly sure you were too good for what I had to offer. A wild prairie and a too quiet man, she said softly. Yes, he said. Cole Whitaker, she said. I would take the wild prairie and the too quiet man over everything else I was ever offered in my life, and I have never for one single day wondered if I chose correctly. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the children asleep, with the prairie outside in its enormous peaceful. Dark, with 3 years of marriage and 2 children, and the full weight of a life built together between them. And his eyes were the gray-green of sage after rain. And he reached across the table and took her hand, and held it in both of his the way he had on the night he asked her to marry him. I know, he said, I know you don't wonder. You've told me in 100 ways since June of 1874. I'll tell you in 100 more, she said. I know that too, he said. I'm counting on it. The spring of 1879 brought a small ceremony of its own. Tomas, now 24 and no longer the lean, uncertain boy who had arrived with Cole 3 years before Eleanor, married a young woman named Catalina Vargas from Lerdo, who arrived in Millhaven in March with her parents and 2 aunts, and a warmth that filled every room she entered. The wedding was at the church in Millhaven, and Eleanor made the wedding cake, and Cole stood up with Tomas, and Alejandro caught Catalina's bouquet, and everyone pretended not to notice. Hetty Caldwell declared it a beautiful occasion, and took credit for predicting it, which she had not, but which no one contested because Hetty at a happy event was far preferable to Hetty at a disputed one. Tomas and Catalina built a small house at the east edge of the Whitaker property with the help of Cole and Alejandro, and several men from town who came out on 2 Saturdays with tools and lumber, and the particular cheerful industriousness of community labor. Eleanor fed everyone both days and organized the work with the efficient authority she brought to anything that needed organizing. And Catalina helped, and they talked while they worked, and by the end of the 2nd Saturday, they had the foundation of a friendship that would carry them through the next several decades. The ranch had become, by 1879, something Cole had not quite imagined when he'd arrived in Millhaven 6 years earlier with a horse with a bad leg, and an inheritance of difficult land and the quiet that was either a strength or a symptom, depending on who was measuring it. It was not vast. It was not the kind of operation that would make anyone wealthy. But it was sound, and it was good, and when the cattle went to market each fall and the accounts were settled and the winter was planned for, there was enough. There was enough, and then the margin beyond enough that meant safety. And that margin had been built brick by brick from the combination of Cole's knowledge of land and cattle and Eleanor's practical intelligence, applied to the business side of things, which she had taken over quietly after the first year, when it became apparent that Cole was brilliant with animals and land and deeply uninterested in ledgers. She managed the accounts and the ordering and the arrangements with the buyers in San Marcos with the same precision she had managed the apothecary, and she found that the skills transferred more readily than she'd expected. Her father wrote that this surprised him, and she wrote back that it didn't surprise her at all because a ranch and an apothecary were both, at the core, enterprises that required knowing what you had, knowing what you needed, and never confusing the two. Cole read the letters she got from her father, and sometimes he read the letters she wrote back before she sealed them, which she permitted because there was nothing in them she needed to keep from him, and also because watching him read her letters with the quiet attention he gave things that mattered to him was one of the small, ordinary pleasures of a life built on small, ordinary pleasures. In the summer of 1880, James turned 5 and began pestering his parents with a focused and specific persistence about when he could learn to ride properly. He could already sit a horse with assistance, which Cole had been facilitating since the boy was 2, but James had a precise vision of what properly meant and communicated it clearly. Eleanor watched this negotiation with great interest. Cole heard him out with the full gravity he gave all things, and then he said, "This fall, after the cattle go to market, I'll have more time." James looked at him. "That's 4 months." "Yes," Cole said, "I'll be almost 6. You will be." "All right," James said, and went back to whatever he was doing, a boy who knows how to assess a fair deal. Cole looked at Eleanor. "He has your negotiating style," she said. "I don't negotiate," Cole said. "No," she agreed. "You state facts and wait for the other party to realize you're right. James does exactly that." Cole looked slightly undone by this, in the way that parents look when a child reflects something true about them. "He's 5, he said. "He's your son," she said. Duchess, the horse that had started all of this, was 12 by 1,880, a mature and dignified animal who had entirely grown into the name that did not suit her. She was still Cole's first horse and still his preferred horse for hard work, though he had 4 others on the property now. Eleanor had her own horse, a steady gray mare called June that she had named for her wedding month and ridden with increasing confidence for 4 years. She and Cole rode out together on Sunday mornings sometimes, after the breakfast things were cleared and before Dr. Marsh's letter was written, riding the perimeter of the property in the early light while Tomas and Catalina minded the children. Those Sunday morning rides were, Eleanor thought, perhaps the most purely themselves they ever were. Out on the land with no particular destination and no particular agenda, just moving through the morning together on horses they trusted, talking or silent as the mood moved them, with the enormous Texas sky above and the grass all around, and the smell of the earth coming up warm from below and everything they had built together behind them and all the days ahead. She would sometimes think, on those mornings, about the girl who had opened a door on a Sunday morning in 1874 and found a man standing on her porch with wildflowers in his hand. How little she had known then about what was standing in front of her, how much she knew now. How the knowing had accumulated not in dramatic moments, though there had been those too, but in exactly these kinds of mornings, small and golden and completely real. Cole caught her looking at him one Sunday in August of 1880, the kind of looking that you do when you are thinking something and the thinking has gotten into your eyes. "What is it?" he said, pulling his horse to a slow walk beside hers. "I was thinking about June 1874, she said. He was quiet for a moment, understanding her reference. "The Sunday." "The Sunday," she confirmed. "What would have happened if I'd still been asleep? I would have left the flowers and gone," he said, "and tried again the next Sunday." He considered. "Yes." "How many Sundays?" she asked. He looked at her. "As many as it took," he said. Eleanor looked at him in the August morning light, at the dark hair going slightly silver at the temples now that he was 31, at the weathered face that she knew every line of, at the gray-green eyes that had been the last thing she thought about most nights for 6 years. "Cole," she said, "you are the most quietly tenacious man on the face of the earth." "It's worked out reasonably well," he said. "Reasonably," she agreed, and loved him entirely and kept writing. The autumn of that year brought something unexpected in the best possible way. Eleanor went to see Dr. Ruiz in town for what she had initially attributed to the fatigue of a busy summer, and Dr. Ruiz, who was by now a confident and capable physician, examined her and announced his findings with the subdued excitement of a man trying to be professional about something genuinely delightful. "You're expecting again, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "April, I would estimate." Eleanor sat with this information for the ride home. James was 5 and Margaret was 3, and the house was full in the way she had never dared fully imagine it might be, and now there was more. She was 30 years old and healthy, and the prospect did not frighten her. It filled her the way the prairie filled on spring mornings, suddenly and all at once. She found Cole at the corral when she got home, working a young horse through its paces with the unhurried patience she had watched 100 times now and never tired of. He saw her face when she dismounted and came to the fence, and he handed the lead rope to Alejandro without a word and came to her. "Tell me," he said. "April," she said. The stillness, the wait, and then reaching for her face with both hands, the gray-green eyes close to hers in the autumn afternoon, the smile that rearranged everything. "April is a good month," he said. "You said December was cold," she reminded him. "April is a very good month," he said. She laughed, and he kissed her in the front yard of the ranch in full view of Alejandro, who had the good grace to become suddenly absorbed in the young horse, and Catalina, who was at the window of her house and felt no such compunction, and made her feelings about the scene known with considerable warmth. Their second son arrived in April, as Dr. Ruiz had predicted, on a morning that was warm and smelled of new grass and the wildflowers that had been coming up along the creek for a week. Cole named him without consultation, which was unusual enough that Eleanor noticed, and she asked him about it when the baby was hours old and she was resting and he was sitting beside her with the boy in his arms. "Robert George Whitaker," she said. "Robert for your father." "Yes," he said. "And George," she said. He looked at her. "Your father has been in Austin for 3 years," he said. "He misses more than he lets on. Thought the boy might as well carry it." Eleanor looked at the man she had married, holding their new son, with the evening light coming through the window and the sound of James and Margaret somewhere outside with Catalina, and she thought that of all the things he had ever done, which were many and good, this was perhaps the one that told her most completely exactly who he was. "He's going to be so pleased," she said. "I know," Cole said. "I already wrote him." She stared at him. "You wrote him before I was even out of bed." "I wrote it last week," Cole said, without looking up from the baby. "Tomas mailed it this morning." "Cole Whitaker," she said, "you are the most organized romantic in the state of Texas." He looked up at that. The smile arrived. The full one, the rearranging one, the one she had been cataloging for 6 years and never once came to the end of. Dr. George Marsh arrived from Austin 2 weeks later, stepping off the stage with his medical bags and his sliding spectacles and a new gray vest, and an expression that was the undone version of his usual careful composure. He held Robert George Whitaker for a long time in Cole's kitchen and said nothing, which was the most eloquent silence Eleanor had ever witnessed from him. Then he looked up and looked at Eleanor and at Cole standing beside her with his hand at her back in the easy automatic way, and he said, "I should visit more often." "We've been telling you that," Eleanor said. "You have," he agreed. "Should have listened sooner." "You're here now," Cole said. "Stay as long as you like, Doctor." Marsh looked at him over the spectacles. "A month," he said, "if that's not imposing." "It's not imposing," Cole said. "James has been wanting someone to tell him about Boston." "Boston," the doctor said with the pleased surprise of a man who has been thought of, "can certainly tell him about Boston. And he wants to know about medicine," Eleanor added. "He's been asking questions since Margaret got a splinter last month." A future physician, Dr. Marsh said, with the professional interest that 40 years of medicine had never extinguished. "He hasn't decided yet," Cole said. "He's also considering ranching and what he called being an exploring man, which I believe refers to something he read in one of Eleanor's books." "He has options," Eleanor said. "We're not rushing him." Her father looked at her, at Cole, at the baby, at the sounds of James and Margaret somewhere in the yard, at the kitchen with its books and stones and mason jars and quilts, and the absolute specific fullness of a home that has been made by people who understand what home actually means. "No," he said softly. "Take all the time you need. The years arrange themselves the way good years do when you are inside them, not as a march towards some future thing but as the thing itself, complete in each season." Robert grew from infancy into a sunny, sociable boy who was everyone's immediate friend and nobody's difficulty. The family's easiest person, which Tomas claimed was because he'd been named after 2 good men, and the combined goodness was clarifying. James at 8 had the focused, serious manner of a boy who was gathering information about the world with great intent and would tell you what he'd concluded when he was ready. Margaret at 7 was the loudest, fastest, most completely herself person on the Whitaker ranch, which had low competition since everyone else was fairly quiet, and she had a particular gift for animals that Cole watched with recognition and some pride. Cole himself, in his middle 30s, had become something that younger Cole would not have predicted, and older Cole accepted with the equanimity he brought to all things. A man people came to with problems. Not because he sought authority, but because in a town and county where men performed confidence loudly and often incorrectly, a man who was careful and quiet, and always turned out to be right, accumulated a reputation that people gravitated toward. He sat on the county land board for 2 years. He helped resolve a water rights dispute between 3 ranchers with such precision and fairness that all 3 parties came away satisfied, which was considered locally miraculous. Eleanor watched this development with the pleasure of a person who recognized exactly what they were seeing. She was not surprised. She had seen it in February of 1874, in the shape of a man on a dark bay horse who knew exactly where he was going. She had seen it in the flowers left on doorsteps in the blue hour, the understanding that the right gesture was worth doing perfectly even when no one was watching. On the evening before the 7th anniversary of their Sunday morning, which they had taken to calling simply the Sunday the way you name a thing that requires no other identification, Eleanor and Cole sat on the south porch after the children were in bed. The sky was the deep blue of summer dusk, and the prairie grass moved in the warm wind, and the stars were beginning, one by one, to come on. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. Do you know what I thought when I opened the door that first Monday morning, she said. When I found the first bunch of flowers. Wrong house, he said, because she had told him the story of that morning long ago, and he had listened with the same completeness he gave everything. Wrong house, she confirmed. I thought someone had left them at the wrong house. And then you kept them, he said. Of course I kept them, she said. They were beautiful. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant something was forming. I went back the next morning, he said, convinced I'd been too presumptuous and should have written a note or introduced myself first or done something more conventional. I nearly didn't leave them. She turned to look at him. What made you? He looked out at the darkening prairie. I thought about you putting them in water, he said. I had watched you through the window. Cole Whitaker, she said, mock scandalized. From the street, he said with dignity. I was passing. You were at the kitchen window. You were putting them in a jar, and you were looking at them the way you look at things that matter to you. He paused, so I went back the next morning, and every morning after that. Until Sunday, he said. Until Sunday, she said. She reached over and took his hand in the dark, the warm, rough hand that had held Wildflowers on 6 mornings before it had the confidence to hold her own. And she laced her fingers through his and felt the solid weight of it, the specific gravity of a person you have chosen and been chosen by and built a life alongside until the life is too large and full and good to ever be reduced to the decision that started it. I'm glad it was Sunday, she said. It was always going to be Sunday, he said. I just needed to work up to it. She laughed, leaning into his shoulder, and the sound went out into the warm summer dark. Inside the house, James slept with a book open on his pillow, and Margaret had arranged 3 rocks and a feather on her nightstand in a pattern that made sense to her. Robert, the sunny, easy one, slept with both arms over his head in the total surrender of very young children who have never had a reason to be anything but at peace. Cole put his arm around her, and she settled against him, and they sat in the dark of the porch with the prairie around them and the children inside, and the years ahead of them as open and full of possibility as the sky over Texas, which was, as it had always been, completely enormous and lit with more stars than any single person could ever count. Wildflowers in the morning, she said, almost to herself. Always, he said. And in the morning, as he had every morning of their married life when the season allowed and sometimes when it didn't, when the snow was thin on the ground and he had broken the ice on the water trough before dawn. There were wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill, not left anonymously, not requiring any mystery, simply there because a man who had once been too shy to put his name to a feeling had learned, over years and mornings and Sundays, that love expressed in action is not lesser than love expressed in words. It is only quieter, and the quiet ones, if you open your door to them on the right Sunday, will fill your life with more color than you ever thought one prairie could hold.